Archangel Michael says, "You found this too soon." Not too soon in the sense that you are unready. Too soon in the sense that most people who reach this message do not find it until they have already lost something, already broken down, already hit the moment where they had no choice left but to listen. You found it before that moment. And that changes everything about what happens next. Do not close this video. Do not scroll past it and tell yourself you will come back to it later, because later rarely comes, and this particular message was not meant to be postponed. Something guided you here today, ahead of schedule, ahead of the crisis that usually forces people to finally pay attention. Consider this a rare kind of mercy, arriving early instead of late. Sit still for a moment. Let your breathing slow. Whatever you were doing before this, whatever was pulling at your attention, set it aside. This message was not written for a distracted mind. It was written for the quiet part of you that is capable of hearing something important, if only you give it enough silence to actually land. There is a reason certain truths are usually delivered late, after the damage has already partly been done. It is because most people will not receive them any earlier. They are too busy, too certain everything is fine, too committed to a version of their life that has not yet cracked open enough to let new light in. It often takes a genuine crisis, a loss, a diagnosis, a breakup, a financial collapse, before a person finally becomes quiet enough, humble enough, desperate enough, to actually listen to what they had been avoiding for years. You did not need a crisis to bring you here. That is rare, and it is worth acknowledging honestly, because it means something in you is already more awake than most. It does not mean your life has been easy. It simply means some quieter part of you has been listening all along, even while the louder, busier parts of your mind were focused elsewhere. Because you arrived early, this message can speak to you differently than it would speak to someone standing in the wreckage of a crisis, desperate for any answer at all. You have the rare luxury of hearing this while you can still choose, calmly, deliberately, rather than being forced into change by circumstances completely outside your control. Use this luxury well. It does not last forever, and it was not guaranteed to arrive at all. Somewhere inside you, quietly, persistently, there is a life you already know you are meant to be living, a version of yourself already known to you in fragments, in daydreams, in the specific ache that arises when you imagine what could be different. This is not fantasy. This is not wishful thinking to be dismissed as impractical. This is recognition, your own inner knowing, showing you something true about your own path, long before your outer circumstances have caught up to match it. Think about the last time this fragment appeared to you, whether through an idle daydream, a passing thought during a quiet drive, or a specific image that surfaces unexpectedly during moments of stillness. Notice how quickly your mind usually moves to dismiss it, filing it away as unrealistic or impractical before it has even had a chance to be fully examined. This quick dismissal is not accidental. It has been trained into you, over years, through countless small moments where practicality was rewarded and imagination was quietly discouraged. Unlearning this reflex takes deliberate practice, beginning with simply allowing the fragment to remain present a little longer than usual, before rushing to dismiss it once again. Most people bury this recognition. They convince themselves it is unrealistic, childish, disconnected from the responsibilities of adult life. They push it down, again and again, until it becomes a quiet ache they carry without fully acknowledging, a low-grade dissatisfaction with a life that technically works but never quite feels fully theirs. This dissatisfaction is not a flaw in your character. It is evidence, consistent and persistent, that something inside you already knows there is more available, even if you have not yet built the courage to pursue it. You found this message before that ache became unbearable. Before it turned into the kind of crisis that forces sudden, dramatic change. This is the mercy. You get to respond now, gradually, deliberately, rather than being forced into a chaotic reckoning later. Do not waste this early arrival by treating this message the way you have treated other quiet nudges before, noticing it briefly, feeling something stir, and then returning to business as usual by tomorrow morning. Consider what it means that certain truths only become available to those ready to actually use them. You were not simply lucky to find this message. Some part of you has been preparing for this moment, whether consciously or not, gathering the small pieces of courage, clarity, and readiness needed to finally receive something like this without immediately dismissing it. Trust that preparation. It was not wasted effort, even during the seasons when nothing seemed to be visibly changing. Something usually reserved for people much further along their own healing journey is being offered to you now, ahead of schedule. Much of what feels like fear in your life is not actually fear of failure. It is fear of your own scale, fear of how large your actual capability is, fear of what would be required of you, and what would be expected of you, if you actually stepped fully into what you are capable of becoming. This sounds strange at first. Most people assume their fear is about not being good enough, not being capable enough, not having what it takes. But underneath that surface fear, for many people, is a deeper, quieter fear, the fear of actually being enough, of actually having what it takes, and therefore losing the comfortable excuse of staying small because it was simply too risky to try. Staying small has a strange kind of safety to it. It protects you from ever finding out what you are truly capable of, which means it also protects you from the responsibility that comes with that discovery. You found this too soon to keep using that excuse indefinitely. The comfortable smallness you have been living inside was always going to eventually crack open, either through gentle recognition, like this message, or through forced crisis, later, when avoidance finally reaches its limit. You are being offered the gentler path today. Take it seriously. The people who seem to have effortlessly figured out their purpose, their path, their calling, almost never actually experienced it as effortless from the inside. What looks like confidence from the outside was usually built through repeated moments of choosing courage over comfort, small decision after small decision, most of them invisible to anyone watching from a distance. You are not missing some secret gene of confidence that these people were born with. You are simply standing at the beginning of the same process they once stood at too, before their own repeated small choices built the confidence you now admire from a distance. This means the path forward is available to you in exactly the same way it was available to them, through small, repeated choices rather than some singular dramatic transformation. You do not need a lightning bolt moment of total clarity before you begin. You simply need to take the next available step, however small, and trust that clarity tends to arrive through movement, not before it. Think about a specific skill you already possess today that once felt entirely foreign and intimidating before you first attempted it. Driving. Reading. A particular skill required for your current work. In every case, competence arrived only after repeated attempts, many of them clumsy, some of them genuinely frustrating, long before anything resembling ease or confidence developed. This same process applies to whatever larger transformation this message is pointing you toward. Expecting confidence to arrive before you begin is expecting the outcome before the practice that actually produces it. Many people wait for permission before pursuing what genuinely matters to them, permission from a parent, a partner, a mentor, a cultural expectation, some external authority whose approval they believe they need before they are allowed to move forward. This permission rarely arrives in the form people are waiting for. Even when it does arrive, from someone whose approval genuinely mattered, it rarely produces the confidence people expected it would produce, because the confidence was never actually meant to come from outside in the first place. You were not supposed to discover this until much later, after years spent waiting for permission that either never came, or came and disappointed you by not delivering the transformation you expected. You get to skip that particular disappointment today. The permission you have been waiting for was never actually going to be granted from outside. It was always meant to be claimed from within, quietly, deliberately, by you, whenever you finally decided to stop waiting. The people who are meant to remain in your life as you grow into a fuller version of yourself will not require you to shrink in order to stay close to them. If a relationship consistently requires you to become smaller, quieter, less visible, less ambitious, in order to maintain peace, that relationship is quietly asking you to abandon parts of yourself in exchange for its continuation. This is not always intentional cruelty on the other person's part. Sometimes it is simply their own fear, unconsciously projected onto you, asking you to stay familiar so that your growth does not threaten their own sense of stability. You found this truth before it had to be taught to you through the painful loss of a relationship you clung to for too long, past the point where it was actually serving your growth. This does not mean every difficult relationship should end abruptly today. It means beginning to notice, honestly, which relationships genuinely support your becoming, and which ones quietly require you to remain exactly as you were before, in order to feel comfortable themselves. Your relationship with money is rarely actually about money itself. It is about safety, about worth, about old beliefs absorbed long before you ever earned an income of your own. Numbers in a bank account matter practically, yes, but the anxiety many people carry around money often has far less to do with the actual numbers than with an old, inherited story about scarcity, unworthiness, or fear, quietly running in the background of every financial decision. You found this before financial crisis forced you to examine these old beliefs under pressure, in a state of panic rather than calm reflection. Take advantage of this early arrival. Examine your relationship with money now, gently, honestly, while you still have the calm clarity to actually learn from what you discover, rather than being forced to learn it later, in the middle of genuine financial distress. Your body has likely been communicating with you for some time now, through subtle signals you have been overriding in favor of productivity, obligation, or simple habit. Tension held in specific places. Sleep that does not fully restore you. A persistent low-grade fatigue that no amount of caffeine seems to fully resolve. These are not simply inconveniences to push through. They are information, and ignoring information for too long tends to eventually force a much louder message through crisis instead. You found this early enough to begin listening to your body's quieter signals now, before they escalate into something that can no longer be ignored. This does not require a dramatic health transformation overnight. It simply requires beginning to notice, honestly, what your body has been trying to tell you, and taking small, consistent steps to actually respond to that information rather than continuing to override it indefinitely. Time is not actually unlimited, though most people live as though it functions that way, postponing meaningful action indefinitely, assuming there will always be more time later to finally pursue what matters. This assumption is not reliable. No one is guaranteed an unlimited supply of later. This is not meant to frighten you into panic. It is meant to offer you clarity while you still have ample time to actually use it well. You found this truth before the kind of loss that usually forces people to confront their own mortality directly. Use this early clarity to examine how you are actually spending your time, and whether that spending genuinely reflects what matters most to you, or simply reflects habit, obligation, and the path of least resistance. You are not actually the roles you play, the job title on your business card, the family role you have been assigned, the personality traits other people have come to expect from you. These roles are real, and they matter, but they are not the totality of who you are. Underneath all of them is something more essential, more constant, something that existed before you took on any of these roles, and will remain after some of them eventually change or end. You found this truth before an identity crisis forced you to confront it directly, the kind that often arrives through job loss, an empty nest, a major relationship ending, or any significant life transition that suddenly strips away a role you had come to fully identify with. Use this early arrival to begin gently exploring who you are beneath your current roles, not to reject those roles entirely, but to ensure your sense of self does not depend entirely on them remaining exactly as they currently are. Consider a simple practice for beginning this exploration. Ask yourself, if every current role in your life disappeared tomorrow, your job, your family position, the identity others currently associate with you, what would still remain? What qualities, values, or interests exist independent of anything you currently do or produce for others? Sitting with this question, even briefly, without needing an immediate complete answer, begins the process of locating a sense of self sturdier than any single role could ever fully provide. Forgiveness is not primarily a gift you offer to the person who wronged you. It is a release you offer to yourself, freeing you from the ongoing cost of carrying resentment, a cost that accumulates quietly, year after year, regardless of whether the person who caused the original pain ever acknowledges it or changes. This does not mean forgiveness should be rushed, forced, or offered before you are genuinely ready. Premature forgiveness, offered only to avoid discomfort, rarely holds. Genuine forgiveness unfolds in its own time, often gradually, and sometimes requires real grief and anger to be fully processed first before release becomes possible. But knowing that forgiveness ultimately serves your own peace, rather than serving the person who wronged you, can shift how you approach the process, especially if you have been holding on to resentment out of a mistaken belief that releasing it would somehow excuse what happened. You found this truth before resentment had the chance to fully calcify into something much harder to release later. Use this early awareness to begin, gently, whenever you are ready, examining what you might still be carrying, and whether it is time to begin the slow work of releasing it, for your own sake rather than anyone else's. Purpose is rarely one single thing, discovered once and fixed forever. It often evolves throughout a lifetime, taking different forms during different seasons. Many people spend decades searching for it, believing purpose must arrive as a single, dramatic, unmistakable calling, when in reality, purpose more often reveals itself gradually, through the accumulation of small moments where you felt most genuinely alive, most useful, most aligned with something larger than your immediate self-interest. You found this truth before years of searching for one single, permanent answer left you exhausted and discouraged, believing you had somehow failed to find what everyone else seemed to have already discovered. Release the pressure of finding one permanent purpose immediately. Instead, pay attention to the smaller moments, throughout your ordinary days, when you feel most alive, most useful, most yourself. These moments, gathered and honored over time, tend to reveal purpose far more reliably than waiting for one singular dramatic revelation. Think about the last week of your life, and try to recall 2 or 3 specific moments when time seemed to move differently, when you felt fully absorbed in what you were doing, whether that was a conversation, a task, a creative activity, or simply a quiet moment of helping someone else. These moments, however small they may seem individually, are far more reliable clues toward your actual purpose than any abstract, grand vision you might feel pressured to produce on demand. Purpose tends to reveal itself through this kind of small, repeated pattern recognition, far more often than through sudden, singular revelation. Genuine connection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels risky, because it involves the possibility of rejection. Many people, without fully realizing it, have built subtle walls around themselves, protective habits that keep others at a safe emotional distance, avoiding the risk of rejection at the cost of also avoiding the possibility of genuine intimacy. You found this truth before prolonged isolation forced you to confront how costly these protective walls have actually been. Consider where in your life you might be maintaining distance out of fear, rather than genuine preference, and whether it might be time to risk a small amount of vulnerability, with someone genuinely trustworthy, in order to begin building the deeper connection you may have been quietly craving. Your own inner sense of rightness or wrongness about a situation, developed through your entire lifetime of experience, deserves far more weight than most people give it. Constant external validation seeking, constantly asking others what they think before trusting your own judgment, gradually erodes your confidence in your own perception, making you increasingly dependent on external approval rather than internal clarity. You found this truth before a series of painful experiences forced you to relearn self-trust the hard way, through repeated instances of ignoring your own instincts and later regretting it. Begin practicing self-trust now, in small, low-risk situations first, gradually building the confidence to trust your own perception in larger, more significant decisions as that trust develops through consistent practice. Failure is not actually the opposite of success. It is a necessary, unavoidable part of the process that eventually leads toward success, for almost everyone who has ever achieved anything meaningful. The people you admire most, whose accomplishments seem impressive from a distance, almost universally failed repeatedly along the way, often far more times than they succeeded, before eventually arriving at the outcomes that made their success visible to others. You found this truth before years of avoiding attempts entirely, purely out of fear of failing, left you further from your goals than actual failure ever would have. Release the belief that failure is evidence you should stop. It is far more often simply evidence that you are actually attempting something worthwhile, difficult enough to carry real risk, meaningful enough to be worth the discomfort of occasionally not succeeding on the first attempt. Every person's timeline unfolds according to their own unique combination of circumstances, resources, challenges, and opportunities. Comparing your specific timeline to someone else's, especially when you only see their curated highlights rather than their full, complicated reality, will almost always leave you feeling artificially behind, regardless of your actual genuine progress. You found this truth before years of comparison had fully convinced you that you were somehow failing by a standard that was never actually fair or accurate in the first place. Release this comparison as consistently as you can, redirecting your attention instead toward your own specific progress, measured honestly against your own starting point, rather than against an incomplete, filtered picture of someone else's entirely different journey. Rest is not a reward you earn only after sufficient suffering or sufficient productivity. It is a basic human need, as essential as food, water, or air, and treating it as optional, or as something to be earned through exhaustion first, gradually erodes your capacity for sustained, meaningful effort over the long term. You found this truth before burnout forced you to learn it through painful, involuntary collapse. Begin honoring rest now, proactively, rather than waiting for exhaustion to force the issue later, when the lesson typically arrives with far greater cost attached. Anger, properly understood, is simply information, telling you that a boundary has been crossed, that something important to you has been threatened or disrespected. Suppressing anger entirely does not make the underlying issue disappear. It simply pushes the information underground, where it often resurfaces later, either as resentment, as physical tension, or as an eventual outburst disproportionate to whatever triggered it in that particular moment. You found this truth before years of either suppression or unhealthy expression taught you the same lesson through more painful means. Begin practicing healthier engagement with your own anger now, neither suppressing it entirely nor allowing it to control your behavior without conscious thought, but instead using it as valuable information about your own boundaries and values, communicated as clearly and calmly as the situation allows. Now that all of this has been shared, consider carefully what it means that you received it early, before crisis forced these lessons upon you the harder way. This is not a small gift. Most people do not receive this kind of clarity until they have already paid a significant price to obtain it. You have been offered a shortcut, not around the work itself, the work still needs to be done, but around the unnecessary suffering that usually precedes people finally becoming willing to do that work. Do not waste this early arrival. It is tempting, after hearing something like this, to feel a temporary rush of inspiration, followed by a quiet return to old patterns once the emotional intensity of the message fades. This is the most common outcome, and it is worth naming honestly, because awareness of this tendency is the first step toward actually avoiding it this time. Choose one truth from everything shared today, the one that struck you most sharply, the one your body reacted to most strongly as you absorbed it. That is the one asking for your attention first, above all the others named here. Sit with it honestly. Notice any resistance that arises as you consider actually acting on it. That resistance is not a sign you should abandon the truth. It is simply evidence of how significant this particular truth actually is for your life. Notice, too, the specific language your mind uses to justify continued avoidance, once you have identified which truth matters most. It often sounds reasonable, even wise. Phrases like "not the right time," "need to think about this more," will start once things settle down a little. These phrases feel like careful consideration, but they frequently function instead as sophisticated avoidance, delaying action indefinitely under the guise of prudence. Notice if this pattern arises for you, and gently question whether the delay is genuinely necessary, or whether it is simply the familiar voice of avoidance, dressed up in more acceptable language. Ask yourself, honestly, what is the smallest possible action you could take today, or this week, that would begin honoring this truth rather than simply admiring it from a safe intellectual distance. Not the entire transformation. Just one small, concrete step. That single step, taken deliberately, is what separates genuine change from the pattern of temporary inspiration followed by a quiet return to old habits. Consider, too, that finding this message early does not mean your path forward will be entirely without difficulty. Early arrival is not the same as an effortless journey. It simply means you get to begin the necessary work from a place of calm choice, rather than being forced into it by crisis. The work itself, examining old beliefs, taking courageous action, releasing what no longer serves you, building genuine connection, still requires real effort and real courage. You have simply been given the gift of beginning that work sooner, with more resources, more clarity, and more calm than you would have had if this message had arrived only after significant hardship had already worn you down. Think about what it would mean, a year from today, to look back and recognize this message as the actual turning point, the moment you finally began responding to truths that most people do not encounter until far greater cost has already been paid. That future version of you, looking back with gratitude rather than regret, is available to you, but only if the recognition arriving today actually translates into sustained action over the days and weeks that follow, rather than fading quietly by tomorrow morning. Give yourself permission to move at a realistic pace. You do not need to address everything named in this message simultaneously. Choose the truth that matters most right now, take one small step toward honoring it, and trust that the next truth will reveal its own appropriate timing once you have made meaningful progress with the first. Remember, too, that finding this message early does not mean you must now live in constant anxious vigilance, worried about missing other important signals in your life. It simply means you have been offered a head start, an invitation to begin certain important work sooner rather than later. Approach this invitation with calm determination rather than urgent panic. Panic tends to produce reactive, unsustainable bursts of effort followed by exhaustion and abandonment. Calm, consistent determination tends to produce lasting change that actually holds over time. Consider, finally, why you specifically were the one to find this message today, ahead of the crisis that usually precedes this kind of clarity for most people. Perhaps some part of you has already been quietly doing the deeper work required to become ready for this, in ways even you may not have fully recognized until this moment. Trust that readiness. It did not appear from nowhere. It was built, gradually, through your own life experience, your own reflection, your own quiet willingness to keep growing even when it would have been easier to stay comfortably unaware. You were not supposed to know all of this yet, not according to the usual timeline most people follow, learning these lessons only after significant hardship has already forced the issue. But you found it anyway, today, ahead of schedule, and that early arrival is itself a kind of invitation, an opportunity to build the life you actually want through deliberate, calm choice, rather than through the harder path of crisis-driven transformation that so many others are forced to walk instead. There is one more layer worth adding before this message reaches its true end, something that ties everything shared today into a single, practical thread you can actually carry forward into your ordinary days. Think about the specific moment, right now, as this message comes to a close, and notice honestly how you feel. Some combination, perhaps, of recognition, discomfort, hope, and maybe even a quiet resistance to everything that has been said. All of these reactions are valid, and none of them need to be resolved immediately before you are allowed to move forward. Insight rarely arrives as a clean, comfortable experience. It often arrives tangled together with resistance, because genuine truth tends to challenge the comfortable stories we have been telling ourselves, even when those truths are ultimately meant to serve our own growth and well-being. Consider, too, that the value of finding this message early is not primarily about avoiding difficulty altogether. Difficulty remains part of any meaningful life, regardless of how much clarity you gain in advance. The value lies instead in facing that difficulty from a place of choice rather than being forced into it involuntarily, from a place of calm reflection rather than desperate crisis, from a place of gathered resources rather than complete depletion. This distinction matters enormously, even though the underlying work required remains largely the same either way. Think about the people in your life who might benefit from hearing some version of what has been shared here today, not because you need to convince them of anything, but because genuine truth, once received, often naturally wants to be shared with others who might also benefit from hearing it before their own crisis forces the issue. Consider, gently, whether there is someone in your life who might appreciate this message as much as you have, someone who might also be standing, unknowingly, at their own early crossroads, waiting for exactly this kind of gentle nudge toward calm, deliberate change. Consider also keeping some form of record as you begin implementing what you have learned here today, even something as simple as a few notes written in a journal or on your phone, tracking which small steps you have taken, which old patterns you have noticed and interrupted, which truths have continued resonating most strongly as the days pass. This record becomes valuable not simply as documentation, but as evidence you can return to during moments of doubt, proof that you have already begun this work, rather than simply having intended to begin it at some vague point in the future. Think about how you will handle the inevitable moments, in the coming weeks, when old patterns quietly reassert themselves, when the clarity you feel right now begins to fade under the pressure of ordinary daily demands. This fading is normal, not a sign of failure. The goal was never to achieve permanent, unwavering clarity from this single message alone. The goal is simply to have planted something today that you can return to, repeatedly, whenever you notice yourself drifting back into old, unconscious patterns. Give yourself permission, in advance, to need this kind of returning, this kind of re-remembering, more than once. Lasting change rarely results from a single moment of insight, no matter how powerful that moment feels in the present. It results from returning, again and again, to the same essential truths, each time reinforcing them a little more deeply, until they eventually become less like effortful reminders and more like natural, automatic ways of moving through your life. You found this message today, earlier than most people ever receive this kind of clarity. What happens next depends entirely on what you choose to do with that early arrival, not in one dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of small, deliberate choices, repeated consistently, over the days, weeks, and months that follow. Being early to a truth is not the same as being finished with it. You have not completed anything simply by reading these words, absorbing these ideas, feeling the recognition stir within you. What you have done, if you allow it to continue, is begin, ahead of schedule, a process that will still require the same patience, the same courage, and the same consistent effort that anyone walking this path requires, regardless of when they first encountered it. Do not let the early arrival become an excuse for complacency, a quiet belief that simply knowing these truths in advance somehow exempts you from the work of actually living them. Knowledge without action changes nothing. It is only when insight meets consistent, deliberate practice that genuine transformation becomes possible. You have been given the insight early. The practice still lies ahead of you, waiting, exactly as it waits for everyone else on this same path, regardless of their starting point. Consider this message, then, not as a finish line, but as an unusually early starting point, offered to you before the usual circumstances that force most people to begin this same work. What you build from this starting point depends entirely on you, on the choices you make in the coming days, weeks, and months, choices that will either honor this early arrival or allow it to quietly fade into the long list of insights felt briefly and then forgotten. You have the chance, right now, to be different from that common pattern. Not because you are inherently more special or capable than anyone else who has ever received a similar message, but because you found this today, with your resources intact, your clarity available, your capacity for calm, deliberate action still fully accessible to you. This is not something to take lightly, and it is not something that arrives without a corresponding responsibility to actually use it well. This message reached you today for a reason. Trust that. Carry it with you. And when you are ready, not before, not because anyone else told you to, but when you are genuinely ready, take your next step. Deep down, you already know what that step is. Thank you for receiving this message today, earlier than most people ever do. Be gentle with yourself as you begin using what you have learned, one honest, deliberate choice at a time.